The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
All right, let's jump ahead here. Let me talk a little bit about manufacturing in general and the competitive challenge to U.S. manufacturing. So the 1990s, manufacturing was 30% of U.S. economic growth, and manufacturing had 2 times the productivity level of the services sector. So manufacturing almost invariably has a much higher productivity level than a services sector. The U.S. is 80% services. So if you really want high productivity growth, manufacturing is a way of scaling goods, in effect, product quickly. Service sectors scale much more slowly because they're more face-to-face, right? So you probably want a significant component of your economy in something that scales fairly quickly, and it introduces productivity effectively. And that tends to be manufacturing. So manufacturing is also traditionally higher paying jobs. In 2001, they were 23% higher than the services sector. The ratio is not all that different today. So manufacturing is an important part of the U.S. economy. It's about 12% of GDP, and it funds 2/3 of industrial R&D. And it funds 3/4 of industrial research and development, and about 2/3 of overall U.S. R&D. And manufacturing firms account for a greater percentage of real GDP than all these other kinds of sectors, right? So it remains a very significant player, but it's also a big enabler for the other sectors. So manufacturing jobs, and there's a lot of debate as to what the multiplier is, and it differs from sector to sector. But it is the biggest job multiplier in your economy. In other words, a manufacturing job tends to create additional employment in the kind of value chains that it's connected with in the services sector and supplier sector and resource sectors. So the U.S. has been running frightening trade deficits in manufactured goods for a significant period of time, right? And it began under President Nixon and has continued to grow since then. The most problematic number is the trade deficit the U.S. has in advanced manufactured goods. In other words, complex, high-value goods. The U.S. is running a $100 billion trade deficit in those goods. So the theory that we'd cede low-end production but make it up by retaining high-end production, it's not working. And manufacturing job loss, has a pretty painful history. 2.7 million jobs were lost in that 2000 to 2003 recession, 5.8 million jobs between 2000 and 2010. The majority of those focused on that 2008 recession. In that 2000 to 2010 timetable, we shut down about 62,000 factories net. The U.S. has been moving its percentage of manufacturing employment ever downward. So we're at about 8% of U.S. employment is in the manufacturing sector. Other countries don't do that. So Germany employs about 20% of its workforce in manufacturing, Italy 19%, Japan 22%, South Korea 31%. In other words, if manufacturing is a source of higher wages and it's a job multiplier, right, you can kind of see some of the potential competitive advantages for retaining a substantial manufacturing sector. So those are kind of background points. Let me do a couple of pieces now. I'll do Glenn Fong and Lin-Soo Kim. So Glenn teaches at Thunderbird in Arizona, which is a very fine school for international business. And he wrote a piece in '98 about what was happening in Japan So in that time period. So Japan is on a complete takeoff as a leading world economy until the 1990 timeframe. And then it misses the IT innovation wave, as we discussed earlier. And it starts to have to reorganize and rethink its innovation system. So Glenn argues that there were essentially three historical stages to Japan's competitive pattern. So first, it was the pursuer after the pioneer, with the US being the kind of innovation pioneer. Then it's a follower right at the frontier with the US, and then it becomes a world-class competitor. And he argues that as Japan became a world-class competitor, it had to rethink its more centralized organization of its innovation system. So the old thesis about Japan, Glenn argues, is that it was focused on national industrial performance and a corresponding competitive balance between nations based on national industrial performance. And it was set by political economies really operating at the national scale, not at the governmental kind of scale, with a strong governmental role. But then a more pragmatic kind of approach had to evolve. So MEDI, which I mentioned earlier, was the key organizing institution around getting collaboration between government and industry and setting industry agendas in Japan. In its older period, it would set technology initiatives that were selected by high-level governmental leaders, including at MEDI. And then in a more recent period, it's had to move towards technology initiatives that are really selected by industry. In other words, it's reached, at the frontier, the ability of government to pick the technology menu becomes more problematic. You've got to get that down to industry decision makers that are much closer to markets and much closer to the innovation system itself. And that has evolved in Japan, that high officials just can't keep an eye on the rapidly evolving complex technologies. So that's kind of technology initiatives. Then there was technology targeting. In the old period, there was direct government targeting of one or two specific technologies, right, that were going to be pursued by the government. And the funding was at the late development stages, right? Government funding was focused really on advanced prototyping and engineering development. That's where the government support was going. In the newer period, Japan shifted towards more fundamental research funding, along with its applied, and put a broader range of technology alternatives onto the table. As Glenn characterized it, it moved to a kind of shotgun approach, not a kind of more narrow rifle shot kind of approach. And then finally, industry targeting. In the older period, MEDI would actually pick winning companies. It would decide who's going to win, designating specific companies for funding. And it would, attempt to influence corporate mergers and consolidations to develop strong companies. So it's intervening at the company stage pretty systematically in critical areas. In the newer period, MEDI became much more collaborative, and it's funding a range of companies and a range of collaboration models, not attempting to target particular surviving firms or winners. In the computing area, for example, MEDI goes from funding 3 firms over a 30-year period to 25 firms, at the end of that period. So it's moving towards a system that is less centralized and more reflective of industry leadership and away from an interventionist government kind of role. So that's kind of interesting. Japan gets to the innovation frontier to a significant governmental role, but when it's at the frontier and it's truly a world-class competitor, it's got to develop a much more decentralized approach that allows ideas to rise up from that system. So that may be an important organizational model for us to consider. That organizational model, of course, is more like what the U.S. had all along, Now, let me put Lin-Soo Kim into this mix too. And his book, Imitation Innovation, is kind of a classic in looking at the amazing evolution of the Korean economy. And the thing to understand about the Korean economy is that the country was just totally destroyed and ruined by the Korean War. And every inch of that nation was fought over a multi-year period, and kind of nothing was left standing. It's a complete tragedy. And the population is completely disrupted. It's forced to, move all about the country. Families are disrupted. Communities and villages are completely disrupted. It's all thrown together, and it's truly tragic. And yet, out of that tragedy is one of the most remarkable stories of, industry scale up and growth of a country that, it's an amazing story, right? And essentially in a 30-year period to construct an economy out of literally nothing that's right at the frontier is pretty amazing. So what's behind this? So in the 1960s period, Lin-Soo Kim argues that Korean firms are on what he calls a leadership trajectory. And the government is on a model of what he calls forced march industrialization. So the government is supplying education through college. On the demand side, it's creating chaebols, which are somewhat akin to the Keiretsu model we were talking about in Japan. In other words, these are major industry leaders. And the difficulty in this mix in the government of the time was its corruption. And this is, Korea is still in the hands of a dictatorship with corruption problems. And the problem with corruption is it creates tremendous uncertainty in your business community. And that was kind of a difficult factor, but nonetheless, the government is playing a key role in kind of pushing these major companies on a march to a strong international role.
Could you clarify what you mean by corruption creates tremendous business uncertainty?
You're not competing with other firms based upon your superior products and your superior ability to manufacture. Suddenly a wild card is thrown into the mix, and you've got to cope with the government and buying off the government and buying government support if you want to stay ahead. So it creates a whole new variable that's much less, that can't be managed by your business processes and systems. So that's why when we read that World Economic Report, that's why corruption was actually one of the factors that was considered in the strength of your economy, is because it can be so disruptive of the ability to have a reasonable and fair competition system. So the chaebols, to go back to our discussion, the chaebols were key to building and capturing these large-scale industries. Now, Korea, when it creates these major companies that dominate industrial sectors, they tend to block entry by small and medium-sized enterprises. So Korea, at the same time, is not creating a system of strong small and mid-sized firms, right? It's really focused on creating these big chaebols that can really function in international marketplaces. But that in turn can create inefficiencies as well, Kim argues. In education, Korea hit on a model of widespread education, and that has been, it's a dramatic story. I mean, the college completion rate there is breathtaking. And, the focus is to get a very highly educated population, which they have achieved, right? And then that highly educated population is able to staff ever more sophisticated industries, right? That's the model. And it works. The one thing they don't do is move their colleges into research universities, which Kim argues is still a part of the model that needs to be achieved. There's a very strong export strategy in Korea. And Martin, go
In
ahead.
terms of research institutions, do they just like send their people to study at research institutions then?
Yeah, they have governmentally supported research institutions. I'll get to a little more on that in a second. The wisdom of the US model is that you combine the education system with the research system. And therefore you create a tremendous amount of learning by doing, right? It seems to work pretty well. If you're just supporting research institutions as separate research entities, you miss the dynamics of that education connection tie, right? It doesn't work as smoothly.
Yeah, I ask because I think it might just be a way for them to cut costs because research institutions might be more complex. So they focus on making a really good college education and then exporting their people to do research in other countries. Then it just might be something to make it more efficient for them to go faster.
Yeah, I think there's certainly arguments there, Martin. One thing that the Korean government did do was it forced its big companies into international competition. So they've got a fairly mercantilist model of not allowing, of protecting a domestic market for their companies. But it's not that big a domestic market. They've got to force their companies out into international competition, and they do it, right? And that builds tremendous competitive strength in these firms. And we look around and see the strong Korean firms. It's a pretty remarkable story. In terms of tech transfer policy, the policy was initially largely reverse engineering of technologies brought in from abroad. But critical capabilities are being developed as part of this reverse engineering effort. R&D policy, it's focused, as I mentioned before, on these government research institutions. The GRIs provide more of a, rather than influencing industry R&D as much, it's more of a talent base and support base, as you were indeed suggesting, Martine, for companies. That Kim also has this very interesting discussion of Korean culture here and what's going on that matches the evolution of this remarkable economic growth. So he argues that in Korea, this interesting blend of an Asian Confucian culture of family and collective support and a collective orientation gets merged with a quite high level of Christianity and its individualism for a very interesting combination. It affects strengths on both ends, strengths on the collectivity side, but also strengths on the individualism side. Some of you may have thoughts about that. Also, the Korean War itself, as we discussed, left the country destroyed and ended village culture, but amalgamated the population in a way that created a certain kind of flexibility as the old social and cultural barriers were swept away. So that it wasn't all bad, I guess it would be Kim's conclusion. And then, because it's a country that has constant threat of war with North Korea, the Universal Military Service provides a huge training opportunity for a management class, in effect. And since military is to be effective, it has to be pretty meritocratic, right? It introduces a whole meritocracy system into Korean society and culture, replacing an older village, more class-oriented kind of culture. So it tends to create there's a series of forces here that tend to create a certain amount of social mobility and elimination of historic social classes going on here, which is part of the story that enables Kim argues Korea to thrive. That military service is an interesting feature, right? I mean, our military, back in the days, which I can remember, you can't, when there was a draft, the U.S. military was actually a very important integrative force in the society, right? That was a very critical step in the U.S. to promote racial integration when you had integrated military units at the height of threats of warfare and combat. it really changed a lot of thinking in society. So there's just an interesting side note there about what that kind of social organization can mean in a social context. But Kim argues that it's an important one in Korea. So Korea develops, he argues, a learning technology culture. So the firms go from what he calls poaching and kind of reverse engineering, and then to reverse engineering, then to R&D, and then to true innovation, right? So Korea is certainly right at the technology frontier in a whole series of areas, and they've moved through a series of steps here to get there. And Kim argues that these are steps. And we tend to frown on poaching and reverse engineering, but let me remind us that the first textile industry in the U.S. was set up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, by an English immigrant named Samuel Slater. And Samuel Slater is working in the British textile factories. And the British textile factories realize that they've got a monopoly on textile production efficiency worldwide, and they don't want anybody else to have it. So you're subjected to a body search to make sure you're not walking out with plans if you're an employee in these factories. And Slater is, searched every time he leaves the factory. What his British employers didn't realize is that he had a photographic memory. Right? So he worked with his textile equipment, goes to the United States, sets up the same stuff in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and brings, a textile industry. So talk about poaching, that's straight poaching. So the textile industry in the United States is organized essentially through the same model and that arguably the same stages we went through. When Lawrence and Lowell are established here in Massachusetts, we're definitely into technological advances at the frontier of textile production at the time. So in a way, we went through similar stages. R&D investment, so there's very heavy R&D investments in the industry chaebols, but the issue Kim raises is that there's not enough SMEs, small and mid-sized enterprises, to provide out-of-the-box kind of ideas and thinking in the mix. And that's a problem in the system, and he argues it needs to be changed. But Korea overall has got a very high R&D to GDP ratio, higher than the US. So the problems are limited university R&D, the need for a larger SME entrepreneurial base. He argues that a more liberalized economy away from the kind of elite Chabot control is an important step. But there's a lot of lessons here from Korea. The role of a strong governmental leadership in creating strong firms, but in effect forcing them into international competition. It's Darwinian. And the government education programs that facilitate very, very strong talent base in the country were clearly key. And the government used crisis to kind of force its firms, it would in effect force its firms into a crisis kind of circumstance so that they would really learn how to compete and survive. So those are all kind of interesting lessons from Korea. So who's got Lin-Soo Kim and who's got Glenn Fong?
I have the kitten.
Okay, and you've got Glenn Fong. So why don't we start with you, Matthew?
Yeah. So I think this slide did a good job of covering a lot of his main points. And I think really interesting is Glenn Fong. He kind of turns this argument on its head, where most people will think about political structures, kind of determining how competitive an economy is. But he looks at the competitiveness of the economy, international competitiveness driving the imperative of the political structure and how involved it becomes as a country moves from a pursuer after the pioneer to a follower at the frontier. And he gives the example of Japan. And one theme that I saw throughout the questions is how much of that process is a conscious decision, or how much of it just kind of happens naturally. Is there a certain point when the government says, "Hey, we are approaching a frontier now. Oh, we should be hands off," or how does that end up happening in practice?
think the approach is probably the most difficult part of the process, just because you have to sort of set up and protect sort of these tables, and systems have to be put in place that kind of borrow on these sort of cultural values that you mentioned, like the strong military service at this point, and a lot of other things sort of have to come together. And so I would peg the approach as sort of the hardest part. But I think once you have your system set up and you're looking to sort of compete or like internationally, I think that's the point where you have to sort of kind of let go. But I think you need to reach some sort of maturity. And I think it's pretty easy to say like, okay, like we've copied everything that we've been able to copy. Like what's next? And then if you don't have anything next, like it might be time to sort of kind of diversify and kind of let things go.
So, Rishi, just to use Glenn Fong's terms, and correct me if I've got this, Matthew, but when you move from pursuer of the pioneer to right at the technological frontier, that's the moment where you ought to think about your organizational model. Because to get to that world-class leadership on a continuing basis may require you to decentralize and change your governmental role to build a more collaborative model and rely on a larger number of players to be able to contribute ideas. Would you agree, Matt? Is that right?
Yeah, I think, well, the way that you said it almost, implies that there's a very conscious decision about how much the government's like to be involved.
I think for Japan, what happened was they realized they missed the IT revolution. Right? That was led by U.S. companies, and we'll read about DARPA and the IT revolution in a later class, but you'll see where that comes from. And by having an R&D system that was pretty focused on applied work with industry as opposed to university research, you get very good at the incremental advances, right? But you may miss fundamental breakthroughs. And so I think Japan is waking up in 1998 to these realities and trying to think about its innovation organization to open up a larger menu of innovation advances. That would be my guess, but I think that's right.
And the other thing I had was, he uses Japan as an example, and like looking at Korea, it does seem to fit, the model. But to what extent does this model actually generalize? Off the top of my head, I used to think of like, the U.S. space program or something like the Manhattan Project, where it's very much at the competitive frontier, but strong government involvement and basically targeting technologies did lead to major advances in research and development. Do we think that the model actually works all the time, or is it necessarily even the best thing to be doing?
Help out Matthew, team. Give him a hand there. He's got a lifeline out there.
Well, I'm curious as to why we, in the general discourse of innovation, only pay attention to East Asian countries, or largely pay attention to East Asian countries, because you never hear about the United States and innovations here being juxtaposed to, say, innovations in Central or South America, or even Eastern Europe. And perhaps, technological advances are not as impressive there, or the sort of breadth of their impact is not as extensive. And at the same time, I think there has to be innovation occurring in other parts of the world that are not South Korea, Germany, China, and Japan. So to what extent is that sort of premised on that kind of American paranoia that was highlighted in the Hughes piece against East Asia?
Yeah, I think maybe a follow-up is like we don't have maybe a good enough counterexample for you, just because the breadth and the highlight and the attention hasn't been put there. And I would hope, in Central South American and these Eastern European countries, they're seeing sort of the pervasiveness of these different models, and there's no way that they're not thinking about these things or adapting their models
Well,
to these sort of things.
I noticed I was at the AAAS meeting last week, and some of the people who were coming in from Russia were saying that they had found that some of the advances that were just being noted in North America had been made in Russia like a decade ago. And they had just never transferred to the international scholastic community because they were Russian-centric. And I thought that that was a really fascinating component about knowledge transfer as well as knowledge sharing, because if our focus is only on competing with East Asian countries and Germany, to what extent are we missing opportunities in the United States by paying attention to other countries that might have interesting innovation cycles or products that we could learn from?
Well, yeah, just to add on to that. So I think the reason we look into Asia a lot is because they were like economies that weren't doing great, and then they pretty much like did a 360 turn, like a 180, like in less than like 30 years. And there's a lot of factors to it. A lot of it was having very strong leaders coming from periods of like not doing too well, so they're more unified, and then having a strong young population. So most of the countries that did really well during this period all had like age pyramid like this. It's a lot of young people, very few old people, and they were able to move very quickly, and especially because they have these strong leaders. These other countries, I think a lot in Latin America, they don't have these kind of strong leaders or these periods that come up beforehand. So there hasn't been rapid growth like innovations, even though there has been a lot of innovation, especially in manufacturing in Brazil, parts of Mexico. So I think it's just we haven't really paid too much attention to it because it doesn't seem like a threat. But these other countries have moved so quickly that it does seem, you can see it more as a threat. Because if you look at Singapore, like it was a country that was pretty much not there. They had a very strong leader, was able to make quick decisions that are very strong and be very strong in saying, this is what I believe, this is what I think we should do, and then going after it. And they were able to completely, just 180 their economy. And I think we were also talking about like the role of government in the US as like committees making decisions for innovation. But actually, Charlie Munger, who everyone knows Warren Buffett, right? More or less. Charlie Munger is his right-hand person, and he says, like, in the past, in general, it's countries do better when it's one very smart, talented leader because they can make these hard decisions. And in the U.S., we do have kind of like an executive, but I think everybody in this table can agree that people don't really like say, oh, he said that, we should do it. So, like, the benefit is, like, these are very credible leaders that most of the time when they make it to that position from a downturn period are very talented and skilled, and they do make bets. Like they can make these hard bets saying, you know what, this is an industry that's going to grow very quickly. Let's put 3 people. There's like 30, 40 companies that could do well, but I think these 3 are really going to win, and we're going to put all our eggs on this basket, and we're going to do well. And that's something that's very, I guess I would call un-American, because we're very much like everybody can go about it. We want to leave opportunity, but these countries do have this capability, and they have already shown that they can grow so quickly versus other countries. I think another thing too is like Latin America, Russia, we still see a lot of corruption. These other countries were able to get rid of it. Like Singapore, what Lee Kuan Yew did was say, okay, I'm going to pay everyone about twice as much, but if I find out that you're being corrupt, you guys are pretty much done. So I don't know if it was like a death penalty or it was like very severe sanctions, but it was also severe sanctions on them and their families. So that's a completely different way of going about it. So I think we just don't see other countries as a threat, even though they have good capabilities. But these countries did do amazing things in 30, 20 years that can't be taken lightly. But you could also debate that it was because there was very young populations, because also Japan and South Korea had stagnations right after. So, and final point.
So Martina, it's a very political economy perspective, right? And going back to some of the points that Matt was making earlier, I think the central Glenn Fong argument is that may get you a fair distance for a period of time as you're getting to the frontier. But then when you get to the frontier, you better figure out a more bottom-up, more collaborative kind of model if you want to keep the ideas. If you need that big mix of ideas that's going to enable you to go to a series of the next things. That's Fong's argument, and that his point is that Japan really had to reorganize its innovation system away from the political economy kind of approach you were describing before to really a very different organizational model. when it reached that, kind of moment of world innovation competition. But it's, and Stefania, in response to your question, in a way, I want to go back to what we talked about in the first class. For a long time, we thought that this innovation system stuff was the way in which the rich countries got richer, right? It was just a way to build further wealth in a relatively modest number of countries that figured out how to dominate and lead these innovation systems. But then other things start happening, right? Korea comes up from being totally destroyed, right? Taiwan, somewhat similar. Economies like India, which is obviously one of the poorest in the world, is able to start building a very significant middle class. And China is the latest element in the story. In other words, an innovation-based growth model can be pervasive and work in the developing world. Now, we've managed to translate that at pretty interesting scale, in parts of Asia. We haven't, you're exactly right, we haven't translated, with the possible exception of Brazil, into a pervasive model in Latin America, for example. So it's, one of the options for doing a paper in this course is to look at other national innovation systems and dive into them. And I really hope some of you will pursue this. We don't particularly focus on this in this class, although we could, but the Brazil story is absolutely fascinating and a remarkable story. Obviously, they're in a fair amount of economic trouble from macro factors at the moment, but nonetheless, it's a very promising and encouraging story overall.
Yeah,
But there are others, and there are other parts of the world too.
So funny that you mentioned Brazil, because while we were talking about this, I remembered that there's sort of major airplane companies or airplane manufacturers. So you think like Boeing,
I
Airbus.
flew open one this morning, Embraer.
Yeah, exactly. And they're based and they're from Brazil, and based in Brazil, and they basically are really important sort of now and will be important in the coming years because Boeing and Airbus dominate these like very large, big airplanes. It's like 787s, like these very large aircraft that sort of only tend to get bigger in scale. But Embraer is important because they focus on sort of shorter flight distances with smaller aircraft and developing out of that market. But I just looked and they were actually in the 90s, sort of this public-private partnership. So came while Brazil is looking at sort of shorter distance flights and doing that a lot better, but it does come sort of this pursuer after Pioneer. And I think they're now probably shifting to build more aircraft, sort of to, instead of like copying smaller aircraft designs, they're sort of having to now become the pioneers and like really start building new, just like smaller scale aircraft and take that market. And Brazil is interesting just because they were allowed to do that. And I don't know what sort of factors played into them being allowed to initially start that public-private partnership in about the 90s when Embraer started. But I think now they're probably going to have to shift pretty drastically and radically and looking to do that. But that's a place I don't think we've touched yet is Brazil.
I think there was a lot of pushback from their competitors for that Embraer was getting unfair treatment from their government in terms of like other trade agreements. I don't remember specifically, but it does cause like rifts with international relations.
So Chris, I'm going to shift over to you, and we're going to do Lin Soo Kim.
Cool. So I think Bill really gave a good background on the article, but
You
just
don't have to say that, it's okay.
he did though. But to go into a bit more about the process of how Korea kind of came up to speed on the forefront of the innovation frontier at that time, they really went through this process of imitating what was out there and then from that basis going on to innovate and to do their own R&D and create more advancements for those products. And this trend was really supported by those close intertwined partnerships and almost interdependence between the government and the chaebols. And the chaebols still exist, like even to this day, they're really like family-centric dynastic corporations. Like the Lee family has controlled Samsung for however long they've been in business. And that centralist kind of government support and structure has really allowed them to enter really high capital industries and really get to the front really quickly, as we've been discussing, has been a factor also in Japan. So just focusing on this right now, we discussed how the focus on the partnerships between the Chabot and the government has kind of stymied the ability of SMEs and the smaller funds to enter the space. So one question that someone had was, like, how can the country catch up the economy and foster both aspects of the larger corporations as well as the smaller businesses? Like, do they have to partition funds, kind of have different initiatives or approaches for both kind of sectors, or how do you guys think they should approach that kind of growth? I guess, go ahead.
It seems like the Chabots are kind of focused in specific industries right now, like construction and electronics. So it's probably going to be harder to get smaller firms to get a footing in those industries. So in my opinion, it would make more sense to kind of pick something new and focus attention on developing those industries. Because I don't think there's going to be like a startup that can compete with Hyundai, but maybe there's something in energy or IT that they have room to grow more.
Or maybe even focus SMEs on more domestic affairs. Like, I don't know if agriculture or some industries in Korea might be a good target for them, potentially.
I think you just need to offer governmental support and financial protection, probably a little bit different than obviously the Chabots need or don't need. But you just have to decide what's the scale that you're trying to look and build at. If you're trying to build in sort of smaller sectors that might be underdeveloped, like agriculture, for example, you might just have to look a little bit smaller than like just trying to cater to 1 or 2 or 3 Chabot companies off the bat.
Any other thoughts?
Chris, do you think that, from your reading of Kim, do you agree with him that Korea needs to foster an SME startup kind of community?
You mean in the context of present day, or
Yeah, present day.
in present day?
Is that going to be an enhancement to Korea's innovation capability? Or do they really need to do this? What do you think?
Personally, I think their structure that really focuses on the bigger corporations and their impact and their ability to really compete globally has been working. So I do think that the corporation kind of push has been successful. Whether SMEs should be sort of supported from the government, I think it's worth kind of exploring. I do think that kind of finding them a niche is really important, because there's kind of no point or kind of redundant for them to try to enter industries that the corporations have a hold on.
I would say, yeah, it's probably important just because it's called like the innovator's dilemma. Usually when you're big, you focus on a specific technology. Like for Kodak, they invented the first digital camera, but because of the way their supply chain and their current business was, they didn't want to manufacture because it would ruin their existing business. So the danger of having too big a giant is, in order to innovate, it takes so much effort on them that they won't do it. And if your economy is based off of that and based on those 4 giants, especially with rapid technological innovation, you really don't want to be in that position. So having that SME structure would be beneficial.
Yeah, I kind of want to hit on both of those. So with the Chabot versus SME structure in Korea, I'm wondering, are the major legacy sort of corporations, are they profitable enough and large enough to be self-sufficient? They don't really need the input from the government as they did decades ago. Could the government focus more on SMEs, and would that be a more strategic way to go about things? Or do they have a situation in Korea? I don't know. I've only been there once, and it was only for about a week, so I don't really know. Do they have the situation similar to what I think we face in the United States, where yes, we have legacy technologies and sectors that are probably self-sufficient at this point and highly profitable, but we're so ingrained the government still gives subsidies to fossil fuel industries, subsidizes their R&D, and that although they shouldn't necessarily need that, it's like that. And they have power so they can continue to get those funds. So what is the situation in Korea? Are they ingrained and can't really separate at this point, or?
From what I know, definitely it's still very ingrained. A lot of the corporations have, I don't know if I don't think it's corruption necessarily, but close political ties to the government in power. So it might be difficult, I think, to separate the two. And going back to the point of whether SMEs could be like on the rise in the future, I think it's also a cultural difference because in like Korean and Asian culture, it's often like more traditional in that it's very prestigious, obviously, to go into these very developed and long-standing companies. And there's not so much an innovation drive like there is here, that like startup culture is really attractive to a lot of the young millennials. I don't think that exists so much, let's say in Korea. So whether it'd be a job to like go to an SME or go to a big corporation, I feel like that wouldn't even be a decision. That would be like, it'd be obvious to go to a big corporation. So I don't know if kind of the cultural stigmas and the standards kind of have guided
Right. So
the development of that.
another cultural point here that we're dealing with about risk taking, really, which is a pretty key element in the U.S. system. Pretty high tolerance for failure. All right, look, good summaries. To get through this, I'm going to push on to our next. Let me just do one chart. Just so you know what recessions look like in the U.S., right, and what's been going on in repeated sequences of recession. Here's the 1981 recession. Dip, rise, right? And jobs come back relatively quickly. Then 1990, it starts stretching it out further, right? Then in 2001, the jobs recovery is really remarkably slow, right? And then the 2008-9 recession, even further out on the level of job reductions. And the painful reality is that you still never recover from the 2001 recession by the time the 2007-8-9 recession is on us, right? So there may be an argument that something fundamental is going on structurally in the economy, right? When you see a chart like that, right? In each successive recession, it's less of a business cycle, it's more structural, right? And it looks like there are deep structural causes in these manufacturing employment declines when you start seeing a chart like this. We'll talk more about it next week, but here's declining median income for the US, which we'll talk more about next week too. So, particularly pay attention to men who tend to historically have played a larger role in manufacturing industries in the US, right? So this is change in median in real earnings for men and women from 1990 to 2013. So, an extended period from 90 to 13. No high school diploma, men median income decline in that time period of 20 points. High school diploma or some college, 13-point decline. Right. And then advanced degrees, 21-point rise. Bachelor's degrees, 16-point rise. This is a society that's going like this, right? And that's what we're dealing with now. And arguably, it's related to this. Let me move to Suzanne Berger. You should get to know her because she's around here and she's really a remarkable talent and has been a great teacher for me. This is her 2005 book called How We Compete. And her essential point is that there are different varieties of capitalism. We've been talking a lot about that today. And that different approaches emerged between US and Asian economies in advanced technology goods in this later part of the 1990s, early 2000s time period. So what's going on here? IT as a driver and codable specs tied to, computer-driven equipment is enabling a divorce between production and design, right? So in the old time period, right, in the prior time period, Suzanne argues that manufacturing companies, production firms, were a lot like model airplanes, right? And you all probably don't remember the era of plastic model airplanes. I do. But you'd get this, batch of plastic parts, and they never quite fit, right? You'd have to work them, and you'd get glue all over them, and the glue would spill over, right? And it would just be a mess. And you'd try and clean up the glue with Kleenex, and the Kleenex would stick to the model. And it would never, and you'd put rubber bands around it to try and get it locked in place, and it didn't, and you'd break the damn thing trying to get it fixed. It was just, that's what manufacturing used to be like, she argues, right? And to manage that, you needed a very integrated vertical system with all parts of that system tied and connected to get around the difficulty of the production process. But with codable IT-based specs and computer-driven equipment, you move to an era of Legos, right? It's all computer-driven. You're going to be producing Legos, and they are always going to snap perfectly in place, right? That's how the production system changed, she argued, from these two different eras. And the classic example is the iPod. Apple was able to pick a mix of MP3 best technologies, and they tied it to a new software access system for music in database form, as you all know, now obviously video as well. They're doing something, a classic Apple move, right? The problem with MP3 players before Apple was that you had to commit a crime in order to use the MP3 player. You were stealing someone's music, right? And it was a criminal act, right? What kind of product forces you to commit a criminal act? I mean, it's not a great product line, right? So Apple invents an entirely different way of organizing the music industry, but it ties it to existing MP3 player technology, which it proceeds to perfect. And how is it able to do this? It's able to do this in a remarkably short period of time. It's a matter of months, right? So it figures out what the optimal MP3 player technologies are, who is producing them, right? And go to them and enter into contracts with them all over the world, particularly in China, but elsewhere as well. And it knows that they're going to snap together like Legos in the end because they are using codable specs on computer-driven equipment, right? So you can now distribute your production model. So Apple can do this in a matter of months. It doesn't have to go buy, green space, right? Outside Wilmington, North Carolina or something, and build a new factory and get all the permitting and spend years doing this and raise $1 billion to do it, right? Instead, it quickly enters into a series of deals with existing producers, but it knows that it can bring the product back, right? Because it's going to be Legos and they're going to snap into place, right? Amazing, right? Absolutely amazing. And, I was in Japan in 2006, and in January, spent a wonderful day as it was snowing in Kyoto, which was completely magical, but it was mostly back in Tokyo. And the headline in the leading English language newspaper in Tokyo was Apple sells 14 million iPods in 2 weeks, semicolon, where is Sony, exclamation point, exclamation point. It was just, a reality that Apple had been able to kind of spring to this whole new product line in a remarkably short period of time by using a digital, dispersed, distributed production model. And it's pretty irresistible because the level of time and investments you have to assemble ahead of time makes this really quite convenient. So lots of US firms move to this model, and they're technologically enabled by these technological advances to do so. Now, Suzanne also goes on to argue, hey, other people, and she's looking at a group of Asian countries and firms, are not necessarily doing this, right? So in Korea, Samsung continues to control the key components. It allows a certain amount of assembly offshore. In Japan, there is a conscious effort to keep integrated in an integrated innovation model and control all the critical stages. So the risk in the Apple model is that you're offshoring your production capability and a certain amount of the innovation capability is going to follow, right? That's the risk. And to avoid that, companies in Japan and Korea are moving in a very different kind of organizational model. Both models, she argues, may well work, right? So these are varieties of capitalism at play here, but the important thing I want you to understand is that you can now, for the first time really historically, sever production and design. And it's pretty irresistible to do so because you significantly reduce your risk and exposure and your investment levels up front. So that's why she would argue US firms tend to pursue this model, right? And we'll go to her next book next week and discover why the model may not necessarily be optimal. But we'll hold that in abeyance until next week. So who's got Suzanne? Let's go ahead then, Matthew.
All right. So in how we compete, basically they look at a whole bunch of different companies in many different industries and try to find what it is that makes companies competitive. So they find that there's no single paradigm, and kind of one of the key lines there is that there's no sunset industries, just sunset strategies. So really, to be competitive, what they found is that companies kind of always need to be questioning their processes, looking for ways to innovate. And then, I got out of it were primarily two different balances. One is this idea of intelligent offshoring, where maybe outsourcing all of your manufacturing is not the best idea because there are other costs involved with that, and you can create innovation gaps within your own country. And then the other balance being with IP and how do you create a collaborative environment where that's conducive to growth and development, but also kind of protecting your IP so that you don't create your own competitor. And so I have some questions here. I think one of the first things is how do companies in fiercely competitive sectors actually set themselves up to constantly be innovating? It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, let me underscore the importance of your question. The number of companies that are 100 years old, you can probably measure on one hand, right? They go through disruption and they change and they die. And it's, long-lasting, long-enduring companies are rare. And it's retaining this innovation capability is so critical. So you're driving at a really key question.
Yeah, because when you mention innovative firms or firms that keep staying at the head, my first thought is Apple, and then I think Apple's 30 years old now, so it's not even, it hasn't even proven that it can withstay the trend. But so I'm trying to think of something that is actually more than 50 years old that has been consistently on top of things.
I think Coke is probably my favorite example.
Coke's
Just
one,
because-
IBM's another.
Yeah, and IBM. I think IBM I know more about just because they develop as sort of in the wave, in the context of like the U.S. is looking for sort of answers in the sort of semiconductor realm, but more importantly, like they had to deal with the whole advent of personal computing, and then they shifted now into more like IT-based services, and so like they just contract out and like solve your problems. And I think it's like you have to be sensitive to sort of these big technological disruptions, and then sort of ride the wave or like get out completely, and sort of like being able to shut down kind of large sections of your like it was previously advantageous maybe for Kodak to use disposable cameras, but now we have digital cameras, and so like you have to be able to be like, okay, we're gonna really radically change the course of our company in order to like sustain and stay alive, and that's kind of a hard decision to have to be able to make. And so I think the resistance to change piece is probably what differentiates your Cokes from sort of maybe your less long-lasting companies.
And next week, you're going to start to read our textbook, which is about the difficulty of innovation in complex, established legacy economic sectors. And that's a large part of the story, I think, Matthew, in answering your question.
I mean, the question too is just like if there's these new capabilities and you don't use them, somebody will. So it's kind of like a Pandora's box because like I might not want to change my whole supply chain and like what's it called, get rid of a ton of jobs for my employees because of the all the things that will happen after. But my competitor is probably going to do it, and if I don't do it, then he's going to have a lower profit. Like he's going to lower his costs, and he'll most likely beat me to market. And there's a quote from Andrew Carnegie, where he goes like, you should always use the best tools, even if it's very hard to change your old tools. Because like as a titan of industry, if you don't, somebody else will.
The other thing I'd like to maybe start thinking about, and I know it goes a little bit into next week's readings here, but like to what extent do you think that design and manufacturing can actually be separated? I know here at MIT, like in the mechanical engineering department, there's still a big emphasis on taking the manufacturing classes in terms of just understanding like when you're designing what is feasible, what is possible to manufacture. And maybe with 3D printing, like it's a little bit more separate. You can basically send anything, it can be made, but there's a lot of know-how kind of embodied in having the manufacturing there too. And I don't fully think that they can be like, or it's wise to fully separate them. I want to see if people also have similar thoughts there.
I was gonna say that maybe the separation is just a figment of our imaginations, because I know that when Suzanne Berger was on the panel in the boot camp course, I think it was Suzanne who said that the designers for Apple spend most of their time not here. They spend their time in the offshore manufacturing.
Shenzhen in particular.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So they're not really separate, although they're quote unquote separate.
Yeah, I think also objective is kind of important, and like if you're trying to separate, like what are you trying to separate in order to do? If you're trying to separate in order to cut costs, like you'll find a way because it'll be more advantageous for you to kind of send your manufacturing section over if you're Apple. But like even if you do that, you're gonna have to send your designers in order to do the next thing, and really consider how am I going to manufacture this thing that I've designed, and like in order to do that, like you can't separate them. So the mechanical engineering department, I think, is probably pretty smart by like training all the mechanical engineers who are then going to go out and design and like manufacture. Even though you might specialize in one or the other, like you need to have a strong basis and a foundation of both, and understand that both are critical in order to like do anything that's probably long lasting or meaningful, and I guess quote unquote innovative.
When we talk about design, what do we mean? Do we mean the designer of an industrial system? Do we mean the designer of an industrial appliance? Do we mean the designer of hardware? Do we mean the designer of software? What components of design are we concerned about, and in what ways is this sort of relevant in the conversation we're having right now about integrative innovation processes?
Well, always the way I'm viewing it when we see, like, we're comparing the design of manufacturing, so I wouldn't think of it so much as like software and primarily hardware, where the design may be, having a 3D model or a layout of my circuit board, that I'm going to send to a manufacturer on the other side of the world who will actually make those components, put them together, and send them back to me. That's at least what I have.
Yeah.
I guess I raise that concern because as a designer myself, I think of myself as a design researcher, right? Because I think about the ways in which you can take systems engineering approaches to social issues. And there's a big debate right now in the design community about what design even is, right? There's this big debate about what design thinking is versus the design cycle and who gets to create it. And there's even more of a debate about the sort of nuances and in exerting the power in creating something, right? Like all of these hardware choices are political choices and they have impacts on both the user and the society in which they're implemented. So that's why I think it's important to really consider when both the author and we talk about design, what kind of design we're talking about, and we view it not necessarily as a neutral and apolitical action, but very much as a reflection of what that corporation values and what kind of values they want to promote in a society. So this, when I look at this laptop, I don't think, oh, this is, beautiful, this is elegant, this is functional. I think this is how this company wants the world to look like. And this is their long-lasting and material vision for what the world could look like for the long run.
Alternatively, I think a lot of design thinking actually is for companies, while we're looking at what we think their vision is in the world when we look at, say, a MacBook, I think a lot of them are looking to, and most designers at Apple would say, in their design process, they're looking at the users and seeing what the users actually want. Also, so there's like a lot of looking both ways.
From a capitalist perspective, the way I would look at it is pretty much like, okay, what are the manufacturing abilities? How much does it cost me? How long is it going to take? What are going to be the issues? Don't make it complicated. Simplify it, because in execution it's going to be way more complex, and I'm not trying to deal with that. And then pretty much like, okay, I'll make sure it's slightly different than my competitors, make sure it follows the values of my company in a certain amount of way, and then when I market it, make you think it's something more than it actually is, because then you'll buy it, because it's worth the value.
I think maybe American Apparel, and sort of like they hinted at like American Apparel, Lucky Brand Jeans, and some other companies that are like very heavy, or their models are like particular because they're based in the U.S. And even though it might be less expensive to sort of like build and like manufacture your jeans or your T-shirts, for example, outside of Los Angeles, you lose sort of other factors, which is sort of like being able to say like made in the USA, blah, blah, but also like you gain sort of production speed and like all of these things that Martine is talking about from kind of coupling the design and the manufacturing processes and like leaving them here. But at the end of the day, I think you do a cost benefit analysis, kind of like Martine said, and then just make sure that your company values is in line with sort of the product and like how you want people to interface with the world through your product.
But then going off that, I'm curious how much of those advantages that you get from producing in the US or like whatever their kind of gimmick is, how like long those will last. Like American Apparel just closed all their stores. So like, does that mean that that approach isn't sustainable and that they should have taken another look at outsourcing? Or is it just, I mean, there are other factors contributing to it, but is that like, do these companies have to pick like what society will want as their special sauce and hope that it lasts long enough, or are they eventually going to need to think about these alternatives?
They definitely should consider the alternatives, but I mean, when, at least with American Apparel, like you were saying, yeah, there's probably a ton of factors, and I think just to answer that question, we just need more data. So we would need to somehow control for the type of industry, the time period, the location, et cetera, and then you could compare. Just like based on the information that we have, the question, we just don't have the numbers to back up either side.
Or another example, I think that this was written before Zara came under fire for a bunch of basically human rights issues,
I mean,
outsourcing.
but I was looking to like, did that affect sales?
Oh, do you
right?
want to lay out the Zara model for us, Lily?
Oh gosh,
Do you know it?
no, not I'm afraid I can't.
I mean, I can
Articulate
summarize
it well.
Or Martine, if you know.
I mean, yeah, you if you know it better, you should know it.
I don't know. We'll find out.
You do it, and then I'll appendix anything.
Please do. It's an example that Suzanne Berger uses, and the point about Zara is that by locating its production facilities very close to its markets, it's able to move from production to its sales system in a very, very short period of time. So by tracking fashion markets and what appears to be moving and selling, it's able to shift its production system quickly onto kind of new styles that seem to be emerging. Whereas if you're shipping that style across, say, 8,000 miles of ocean in a container ship that's moving at 8.5 knots, right? You're not in the game, right? So Zara has figured out how to keep that relationship between production facility, market, and sales facility very tight, and therefore be able to serve emerging markets. And fashion is somewhat different in other areas, but the point I think is still there. But serve emerging markets very quickly, so rising to your market opportunities in very short periods of time. How's that, Martina? Is that?
What I'll add is like pretty much what they do is like they go into the fashion week and they're like, oh, this is a really expensive thing. What we're gonna do is we're gonna find a very cheap way of doing it. They have it on the market like by 2 weeks pretty much. So they like rapidly design and they go for a low price point and then they'll put it into the market and then people will buy it. But you're not really buying it because it's like you're not buying for value. You're buying because this is trendy and I don't want to spend that much. And that's kind of their value prop right now because they're usually like slightly more than H&M. But it's just like that right model for like, I want to buy a good amount and I don't want to look like I'm from like 10 years ago.
Does that sound right, Lily? Okay.
But yeah, I would have to look at the data of like how their sales were affected because I think some people do care or they might act like they care, but probably when they vote with their dollar, like, because there's Zara and there's H&M, but like there's not too much of a difference. And I'm pretty sure they have different products. So somebody might be like, oh, I really like this sweater from like Zara, so I'll definitely go that way. I think it's a very, I would debate that there's a very small percentage that'll be like, oh, I'm totally never going to buy from the store again. Or I'm totally not going to buy from the store again, and then not go back to buying from it like 2 weeks later.
So I'm going to bring us back to Matt since we've now gone off into the fashion model. Back to some more fundamental. Do you have some closing points you want to make on Suzanne's book? What do you think is really key in it?
I think one real key point that maybe we didn't get as much time to talk on is that maybe we have, as Americans, this idea of a birthright to being at the forefront of innovation, and really pointing out that no one who's complacent and sitting on their laurels will stay in that position. And I think there's a good contrast to be made between her ideas on outsourcing versus Berger's. Something to think about.
Good point, Matthew. All right, that brings us to our closing reading. This is one of MIT's great provosts, Joel Moses, who was deeply involved in the early and indeed later stages of the computing revolution. So this is a young Joel at Project Mac at MIT, which is MIT's implementation engine for a lot of the early computing advances. So Joel steps back and writes this kind of fun piece, which I wanted to throw in here at the end to pick up our determinism theme one more time. We've been talking about different kinds of innovation systems and how different countries have varieties of capitalism and varieties of innovation systems. And Joel takes us back a step and gives us more of a 10,000-foot kind of look, which I've always been intrigued with. He argues that there are three fundamentally different design methodologies. So this is a design methodology in a societal sense rather than engineering design that Matthew was leading us through earlier. And he argues that historically the US has used what he calls a tree and branch organizational attempt, which creates very hierarchical firms. And he argues that this very hierarchical system, right, and you can picture what the organization chart looks like. It's like a tree, right? Top management, all the way down through many different hierarchies of levels. That fits a mass production economy. This is the kind of economy that was compelled coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And it's organized for manufacturing at a national scale for national markets, where a lot of vertical integration is required. So think about the big 3 US car companies. Now, then he makes an interesting additional point, which is this, by the way, fits an Aristotelian hierarchy of ordered knowledge, right? This is the way in which Western thought organizes science, right? That's what Aristotle is doing. He's creating these tree and branch systems. Surprise, it shows up in industrial organization in the West. But he argues that the tree and branch hierarchy means tremendous inflexibility and great difficulty in managing change. Because you've got to bring all those different systems, all those different levels in line in order to pursue change. So, the second design methodology is around what he calls a layered system. And he argues that Japan's incredible success of the 70s and 80s is not just a different industrial model, right? A quality production model. It's deeper than that. There's a whole social organization set of issues that's coming along with it. And Stefan, you were driving towards some of these points, I think. So in Japan's system, there are separate kind of layered levels. And you tend to move through your career with your age cohort. And as a group, you move from level to level. And there's obviously several levels here. It's much less tree and branch hierarchical. It is pretty flat within that age cohort, right? And you tend to know that you're going to move with your level into successive positions. So it forces a significant amount of consensus, right? So Joel's interesting comparison is, this is Plato's Republic, the philosopher king, the guardians, the citizens. Those are kind of layers. So not an Aristotelian, but a Platonic model. And then he says there's a third, right? And this is the network model that the US nurtured coming out of the IT revolution, which is much flatter, right? Much less hierarchical, not even layered, right? It's pretty flat. And it's driven by the kind of collaborative group innovation systems that are required for the development of the IT sector. That a rigid tree and branch hierarchy is just not going to work in that IT world, which requires a tremendous amount of almost democratization of the workforce, right? So back, Martine, to your Andy Grove analogy, when the leaders of Intel, when Bob Noyce and Grove and Gordon Moore are setting up Intel, right? There are no offices, right? Everybody's got a cubicle, including Noyce and Moore and Grove, right? So Joel's complaint is that, that the network model, Joel argues, is actually much faster and much more flexible and much more subject to change than even the layered model that Japan brings up. And so you start thinking here, gee, no wonder the US auto industry got rolled when it came up against Japan's layered model. And then you start thinking, oh, no wonder Japan missed the IT revolution if the organizational model required this network. Now look, these are highly speculative. We'll never prove these, right? They're really only for discussion purposes. All of us kind of know that there are more complex stories behind it. But I think there is an idea, right, about the relationship between social organization and the kind of industrial developments that society is going through and the kind of organizational models that those compel. Joel's great complaint is that engineering lacks the models to be able to grasp these different organizational structures, that you can't really fit that within a traditional kind of engineering analysis. And that engineering, therefore, needs to rethink this. That's part of the reason why he's a major leader of MIT's engineering systems division, right? Which of course has now been closed. But that's part of what Joel and some of his colleagues are trying to do when they set up ESD here at MIT. I mean, that's, I just want to kind of close out by saying that there's another thing that we'll need to consider as we move into next week's class, that the whole nature of competition is changing in manufacturing, that it's no longer a world of manufacturing goods, it's a world of manufactured goods that are fused with IT technologies that in turn are service delivery models, so there's a whole fusion of services and manufacturing going on that makes some of the stories we've been talking about today more complicated. In past decades, the story was quality. Now there's a whole level of customization and speed and customer responsiveness that we have to think about as well, and your ability to get on top of those as well as on quality becomes key. It's not simply the best technology, but it's the best technology plus the best business models and delivery models that have to be thought about. There used to be trade in goods, trade in product. Now there's trade in all kinds of knowledge management and services that are tied to these products that becomes critical factors in your ability to compete. In the past, it was the workforce skills side. Now it's much more continuous learning in your workforce. Then it was low cost of capital. Now it's efficiency in all the financial services stages that you've got to get through the hurdles of, right? Not just the initial capital cost. So, and there's a whole evolution of intangible capital as well. So there's a whole new set of factors that's coming into the manufacturing world that we've only started to glimpse from today's discussion. But let's go back to Joel and his three models. Chris, it's all yours.
Cool. So I guess to summarize, Joel is presenting these three models, the hierarchical decomposition model where it's the branch tree structure, the network design model, and then the layered design model. And then he basically goes on to outline a bunch of examples where you could apply different methodologies into analyzing various systems. So he goes through like a philosophy example, he goes through manufacturing, even kind of more science-based, so like the models of the human mind and body. And one of them I found particularly interesting was where he brought up culture and how like preconceptions of how engineering and manufacturing is viewed here versus, let's say, Germany or Japan has really impacted the way these countries have responded towards shifts in manufacturing and how that industry develops, and also how cooperation in Japanese culture has really allowed the precipitous rise of their industry and manufacturing capabilities. And how that shaped and kind of forced American firms to adopt a similar structure or methodology in order to compete. So that's just one example of how, interestingly enough, a lot of the examples were not really engineering based, even though he started from the hierarchical model, which is seen very often in engineering. And I thought that was really interesting. We can definitely go into some of the examples more if anyone has a particular one to go into. But to start off the discussion, I thought this question was really interesting. How does a country shift from a tree structure, so the hierarchy one, to a more layered or network structure once it's already been established? So if there's any thoughts, feel free to throw them out.
So I took a class called like structural organizations, and it talks about like, so it's not like there's a right or wrong answer. It just really depends what you're trying to do. So in general, when it's more networked, it means you want to make better decisions. But the drawback is that it'll take a much longer time. Hierarchical, you might not make great decisions, but you make them very quickly, and as long as people respect the person who's making the decision, it turns out to be pretty much okay. In terms of a company, I think it really does depend, because like, I think network structure works great for like a Facebook or like something with internet based, where you're really competing for ideas. You're trying to come up with these ideas. Things move quickly, so you want to iterate quickly. Versus, I think if it was like manufacturing, like I wouldn't want that as much.
Chris, did you agree with Joel's presentation here? Do these models make sense to you? You more or less got an interesting story out here. Or what do you think?
I thought it was interesting how he presented kind of 3 frameworks for looking at different firms, and then went about kind of applying that model to different situations, companies, industries. I thought that was interesting. Again, just like some of you, I had a little bit of trouble distinguishing between some of them as I was reading it. So perhaps kind of going into more about defining the differences between the different models, and also maybe even trying to generalize which model would be applicable to, like what characteristics would be most amenable to these models. That could be an interesting kind of additional step.
Okay. All right, I think on that good note, we will end a few minutes early.